Hello, everyone. My name is Alexis Navarez, and today I'm going to be comparing Brazil and Guatemala. So, why am I comparing Guatemala and Brazil? Well, Guatemala and Brazil were both dictatorships that turned into democracies, but their living standards are different according to the World Bank data. In this project, I'll be comparing and contrasting both countries in order to understand why Brazil has a stronger democracy and higher living standard than Guatemala. In order for me to do this, I will be splitting this presentation into four bullet points. I will provide a brief overview of the economic backgrounds of both countries by comparing indicators, including the HDI, GNI per capita, and income inequality. And then I'll also analyze historical factors, especially how colonization has affected the government in both of these countries and influenced their current outcomes today. And then I'll also propose a policy that'll better improve Guatemala by proposing a decentralization policy. So, a little bit of background. In the 1954 US backed coup, ousted President Jacobo Arbenz and not only reversed efforts at land reform, but also marked the beginning of military rule and authoritarianism in Guatemala, which triggered decades of authoritarian rule and sparked brutal civil war from 1960 to 1996. I think one key difference in the historical background between Brazil and Guatemala is how their authoritarian periods played out and what impact they had on the country's development. For instance, the 30 Guatemala's 36-year civil war between the government and leftist rebels left indigenous communities were especially targeted, and the conflict left deep social and economic scars. Um, for instance, there were massacres, disappearances, and forced displacements enforced by the state on indigenous communities. And then their military regime dominated most of this period until 1985, where it returned back to civilian rule. However, due to its uh, historical background, it left to what we see in Guatemala today, which is social divisions, weak institutions, and minimal investment in public services. Now, Brazil has experienced a 21-year military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985, following a coup that ousted President Raul Goulart amid Cold War tensions. The regime suppressed civil liberties and political opposition, especially through the repressive AI decree. However, Brazil's military government also oversaw rapid industrialization and urban growth, particularly during what's called the Brazilian miracle in the 1970s. Though economic inequality still remains high, the country emerged from dictatorship and was able to resolve peacefully and into a democratic constitution in 1988. Since then, there have been social programs to help fight this inequality, such as Bolsa Familia, which is made progress in education, healthcare, poverty reduction, and then I will talk more about it later on in the presentation as well. So, a little bit of analysis on the differences between both of the countries in order to know why it's important, what policy would be needed for Guatemala. So, a difference between the country's economic states is that Guatemala has a score of 0.662, which falls into medium development by the Human Development Reports of this year, 2025. And then, according to those same reports, Brazil falls into 0.786, which is the high category of development. And then we also see This also shows that there's a gap between life expectancy, differences in life expectancy, access to education, and income from both of these countries. And then we see the gross national income per capita is another telling measure. Brazil's GNI per capita is 9,950, while Guatemala's is 5,780. Brazil's capita is nearly double, which points to disparities in economic opportunity and earnings between both countries. And it's important to note that Brazil's economy is more diversified and urban centered, while Guatemala continues to rely heavily on low wage agricultural labor and remittances. Um, and then there's the Gini index, which shows Brazil at 51.6 and Guatemala at 45.2. Um, and then there's they have different um, systems of government systems. While they're both democracies, Brazil is a federal republic, meaning it has strong division of powers between the national government and 26, and it has 26 states plus the federal district. Each state has its own government and autonomy. This federal system allows for regional diversity and local decision making, which can promote development to tailored needs, while Guatemala, on the other hand, is a unitary state, um, which means that there are, although there are departments with some administrative roles, most of the decision making is centered in the capital, Guatemala City, which limits local autonomy, especially in rural and indigenous areas. So there's definitely different national priorities. So it doesn't give a voice or advocate for people who are marginalized in Guatemala. So another thing I wanted to call out was Brazil has uh, extreme has made more meaningful attempts to reduce extreme poverty through redistributive programs such as Bolsa Family, which provides conditional cash transfers to millions of low income families, which has successfully expanded access to education and healthcare. And it's a really good model for addressing inequality. However, on the other side, inequality still persists a lot more in Guatemala, especially in indigenous and rural areas, where access to education, healthcare, and infrastructure is a lot more limited, which has led to, and even attempts at land reform have been politically blocked for decades, which has led to reinforced cycles of poverty and underdevelopment. So, because of this, I think that's something that Guatemala can do to that is kind of similar to what Brazil is doing is they could decentralize. I think it's important, especially when we think that centralization has limit local autonomy to rural and indigenous areas, and decentralizing would mean um, such a difference for Guatemalan development because more of this decision making power is going to go to smaller governments that oversee underserved areas, which maybe can improve can improve the relations between the government and indigenous people in Guatemala. It's also important um, to for me to say that a stronger and more inclusive version paired with inclusion version, such as centralization, paired with investment in local institutions, can help reduce the divide and promote a more inclusive development, which can be a pathway forward for Guatemala, especially due to its um, background and history, being a military regime who has oppressed indigenous populations in the past, and its affects how uh, rep, uh, marginalized communities are represented today. So while Guatemala and Brazil both share historical experiences of colonization and dictatorship, they have taken very different paths in terms of development. Brazil has been more urbanized and has more of a stable democratic institution, while we see higher living standards and stronger public services, such as I called out Bolsa Family. That is a program that Brazil has. And Guatemala continues to face significant challenges due to its rural economic base and political exclusion, and limited institutional capacity, which is why I propose that it might be better to implement a decentralization policy because it can focus on these marginalized regions. And then it could take a step towards reducing inequality, strengthening the democracy and the people's trust in the government, and even just improving the whole standard of living in Guatemala. And then these are some of the references that I used. And then I did use citations throughout um, my presentation that I had cited. So thank you, and I hope you guys have a great day.